Good afternoon and welcome. I am Karthik Ramakrishnan. I'm the Associate Dean of the School of Public Policy, and I would like to welcome you all to the first installment in our series this year for the School of Public Policy Seminar Series. Dean Devlalikar wishes he could be here, but he got called on relatively short notice for a trip down to Mexico. It's not a junket. They're actually doing some business down there with some other deans to explore research opportunities between the University of California system and Mexico. Today it's our distinct honor to welcome to the campus Controller for the State of California, the Honorable Betty Yee. Her talk today is titled From Gold to Silicon, What's Next? The Past, Present, and Future of California's Economy. Very intriguing title, and we're all very eager to hear what's next. There's going to be, whenever people try to forecast the future, it's always perilous in California. I don't think there's going to be any seance or anything here, but it'll be so intriguing to see where California has come and where it's headed. Before I bring up our distinguished speaker, I would like to first go over the format for the seminar. As usual, we'll reserve the first 45 minutes to an hour for Controller Yee's presentation, and then we'll leave some time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. So please hold your questions until the very end. Now for some background about our speaker. State Controller Betty Yee was elected in November 2014 following 2 terms of service on the state's Board of Equalization. As Controller, she continues to serve as on the board as its 5th voting member. Controller Yee was first elected to the Board of Equalization in 2006, where she represented 21 counties in Northern and Central California. She was elected to her second 4-year term in 2010. Now serving as the state's Chief Financial Officer, she also chairs the Franchise Tax Board and serves as a member of the CalPERS and CalSTRS, is that it? CalSTRS, there we go. CalSTRS boards. These 2 boards have a combined portfolio of nearly $500 billion and is a major force in the investment world. Controller Yee has over 30 years of experience in public service, specializing in state and local finance and tax policy. She previously served as the Chief Deputy Director of Budget with the California Department of Finance, where she led the development of the governor's budget, negotiations with the legislature and key budget stakeholders, and financial analyses of legislation on behalf of the administration, fiscal analyses, I should say. Prior to this, she served in senior staff positions for several fiscal and policy committees in both houses of the California State Legislature. Controller Yee currently serves on the board of directors of the Equality California Institute. She's co-founder of the Asian Pacific Youth Leadership Project, which exposes California high school youth to public service, public policy, and politics. A native of San Francisco, Controller Yee received her bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. She was just talking about how it's great to be back on a UC campus. And she got her master's degree in public administration from Golden Gate University, San Francisco. Please give a warm round of applause to Controller Betty Yee.
Thank you, Dean Krishna. Good evening, everyone. First of all, let me just say it's an honor to be here on the campus of UC Riverside and to launch the speaker series for this year. The talk I'm going to give is actually going to be a hybrid of a lot of different issues, but before I begin my conversation, which I hope it will be a conversation, I just wanted to speak a little bit about the role of controller, but also put it in context with respect to the state of California. You know, we sit here today with the state of California as the world's 6th largest economy. And much of that has to do with the fact that we have a diverse economy. It is a global economy. But when we look at our economic rankings in the world, oftentimes it's because of what we're doing in California right, relative to growing our diverse economy. And sometimes it has to do with what might be disruptive in other parts of the world that elevates our ranking. And we actually became the 6th largest economy after the Brexit vote in the UK. So just to put that into some perspective. The other thing, I've been meeting some of the students here today, and some of the student ambassadors, and I know all of you are involved in some aspect of public policy or just have an interest in public policy, from policy at the very local level to state, national, and even international level. And just to give you a sense of how California is really a nation state when we do policy work, in my role, as the dean said, I do serve Actually, I serve on over 79 boards and commissions as controller. The main ones being the public pension funds for public employees and the state teachers retirement system. But also have jurisdiction over tax policy, chairing the Franchise Tax Board, a member of the Board of Equalization, as well as a number of different environmental and different financing authorities that are helpful to various sectors of our economy. But as I look at what we do with the pension funds particularly, this is where I think my reach really gets me in touch with how global California really is. We have, as the Dean said, a combined portfolio of both of our pension funds close to $500 billion. But part of the work that we do as pension funds is that we do a lot of corporate engagement with the companies in which we invest. And we do that because we want to be sure that the companies in which we invest are very focused on doing everything they can to create long-term value, so that our investment of pension assets actually yield us a healthy return, so that we can pay the retirement benefits that are guaranteed to our public sector workforce and our educators. And as we engage companies worldwide, it's very clear that there are very different perspectives about what it means to create long-term value. And when we look at issues that are affecting California today, so we're the sixth largest economy, but we also happen to be home to the highest rate of poverty in the United States. And as we see growing prosperity, we also see inequality growing as well. And so when we look at long-term value, it's really, what do companies do with their human capital, their fiscal capital, their financial capital? And are they really conscious of the fact that in order to be sustainable and to create long-term value, that they have to manage their own risks, whether it be climate change, whether it be looking at being sure that their supply chains are also looking at some of the global risks that will be affecting them. And so that's the kind of corporate engagement that we do. But it gives you a sense of just how connected we are, but also how really widespread we are as well. Widespread in perspectives, but connected in terms of just having that relationship, and in this case, an investment relationship. So as the state's chief fiscal officer, it's my job to pay the bills for the state of California. That's the commonly known job. But as controller, my duties are quite varied, and they relate to being sure that the revenues that are expected to come to the state of California do come in. I manage the state's cash to be sure that at any given day we have enough money to pay our bills, that we don't have to do any external borrowing, and that we can manage all of our obligations with internal borrowing among our thousands of funds in our state treasury. Looking at preparing the financial statements for the state of California, and also auditing public funds both at the state and local level. And it is a broad responsibility, but it is a responsibility that I take seriously because of all of the fiscal positions in the state. This particular office is the independent fiscal watchdog. So I'm not accountable to the governor's administration nor to the legislature, and we have the only independent auditing authority in the state, as well as really calling what we see as financial risks that are approaching California, hoping to advise and provide guidance to our policymakers relative to our financial condition. But also, as I think about my role as controller, we can't have a healthy state economically without ensuring that every individual and family in California has the tools and the know-how and the opportunity to succeed and thrive. And so the financial health of individual Californians is a very important objective for me. And so we do a lot of programming out of the controller's office. I want to introduce Nicole Jones, who heads up my external affairs operation here in Southern California. But the whole notion of financial education and financial fitness is something that we spend a lot of time on, particularly with students, particularly with seniors, given that we are experiencing a crisis of retirement insecurity in this country, and also particularly with low-income communities that don't have a lot of available resources to make ends meet. So even as our state and nation have enjoyed sustained economic growth and recovery from the Great Recession, it's clear that the effects of the recovery have not been felt by every corner of the state. And in many cases, those who've not been lifted up by the economy and the recovery are the same people who've been sidelined by the digital revolution. And I'm going to try to kind of mix two themes here. One is we still have a growing digital divide here in California. And I say growing because there hasn't been a lot of progress made on providing broadband and certainly connectivity in many parts of the state, but also looking at how the economy continues to shift to where if we don't make any progress relative to expanding broadband access and the ability for Californians to connect, that we're essentially going to have our economic shifts leapfrog and those opportunities elude many of these communities in California. So technology enables us to do business with anyone in the world and from anywhere in the world. That was kind of the original thought about the advent of technology. We hope that that can be a reality someday. But yet a recent field poll statistics show that right here in California, which is the home to Silicon Valley and the giants of the internet, 30% of people still do not have access to reliable high-speed broadband in their homes. That's almost a third of Californian households. U.S. Housing and Urban Development Secretary Julian Castro recently described broadband access as a tool people need to be competitive in the 21st century global economy. And the challenge is that state structures and policies often fail to keep pace with the changing face of society and advances in technology. And of course that means we're not doing all that we can to prevent anyone from being left behind. So this is a major, probably if you talk about infrastructure in California, I would say that in terms of how we can have sustained economic recovery for everyone in California, this is a key piece. I know I was invited, I accepted the invitation to be here tonight by Lloyd Levine, co-founder of your Center for Digital Literacy, and I'm sorry he's not here, but this is actually a tribute to the work that he's trying to do in terms of closing that divide. So it's important to understand that what's happened in terms of the shifts in the California economy over the 166-year revolution that has led us to where we are today. Back in the state's official birth year in 1850, California had grown exponentially from a population of 7,300 just 2 years earlier, since the discovery of gold. And a state that had mostly known agriculture and timber was suddenly booming with miners and tradesmen. The first long-distance telephone line was still 27 years away, so Californians dealt with intermittent mail service. It was Pony Express a few years until the introduction of the telegraph in 1861. And the Pony Express we all learned about in our elementary school history, but making the treacherous rides through the Sierra Nevadas, but that became unnecessary with the discovery of the telegraph. The government imposed a property tax and a poll tax the first year in 1850. So this was a way that we were going to finance government in our early years. And these taxes were only collected sporadically, and California financed most of its operations by issuing debt. Now, in just a matter of 15 years, state debt was double the annual budget, about $5 million. After the Civil War, our state's finances and its approach to fiscal management improved dramatically. The railroads soon came along, bringing additional commerce, population growth, and more consistent delivery of postal mail. California was able to pay down our debt, and a few years later started regular collection of property taxes, which were our main revenue source for many, many years. California's manufacturing sector grew significantly from 1929 to 1997. And in the years during and immediately after World War II, manufacturing output actually tripled as California became a hub for building ships and aircraft and electrical components. At the same time, California became increasingly interconnected, with a phone in nearly every home and a car in almost every driveway. Just a few years into this manufacturing period, California enacted its last significant tax reforms to date to better reflect our new economy at that time. A sales tax on goods was instituted in 1933, and the personal income tax was added in 1935. Now, while our tax system has not changed much since that manufacturing heyday, we all know that our state and our economy has changed dramatically. Most famous and obvious, the silicon and digital boom. California has grown from a population of 7,300 in 1848 to a state of more than 39.3 million diverse people in 2016. More than 4 million people now call the Inland Empire home, and more people are moving in every day. Society is more interconnected than ever, and that free flow of information and communication is more critical to individual success than ever before. And today, there isn't probably anything that you transact in your daily lives, from accessing medical records, making appointments, to connecting with your service providers. In rural communities with strong broadband, you can even have an appointment with a doctor halfway across the state over high-speed internet. Go online to look for a new job, to register for your classes. It is now today what we're looking at is still 16% of Californians do not have broadband access, and another 14% only have access through a smartphone. In the Inland Empire, those numbers are even higher, with 18% lacking reliable broadband and 17% with only phone access. And those who only have broadband access through a smartphone are considered underserved. They can't really fully navigate all the websites and print needed paperwork, so they're certainly not on an even playing field with those who are connected on a laptop or even a desktop. Now, just in terms of a regional perspective, statewide, California has become much more of an internet-reliant, service-based economy, looking much, much different than we did in the 1930s. Even so, our tax structure relies on the sale of goods and the personal income taxes of the wealthiest few, which watch their worth spike and drop with the ups and downs of the stock market. So California as a whole lost 215,000 manufacturing jobs from 2005 to 2015. And the Inland Empire is one of the few regions in the state that continues to show strength in the manufacturing sector. After a drop during the Great Recession, manufacturing employment in the Inland Empire has gone up by 15% since 2010. Unemployment stood at 6.6% in August compared to 10.5% just 3 years ago, and many factors play into this. Riverside and San Bernardino counties' proximity to two major ports and the intersection of major interstate highways make the Inland Empire an attractive and perfect hub for the distribution of goods. The continued availability of large swaths of land at reasonable prices have lured both families in search of affordable housing and large companies like Amazon and QVC. Logistics required for the success of large distributors such as these requires reliable, unfettered, high-speed broadband access. The private interest sparked by companies of this size building distribution centers in the Inland Empire certainly advances the cause of reliable, high-speed broadband for the region. And according to the Public Utilities Commission, only 34% of rural households have access to reliable broadband service, largely because of the cost-benefit analysis by private entities who generally lay the fiber optic cable. So we see that with more private sector interest in particular regions that we're seeing a bit of improvement with respect to this infrastructure. But the Inland Empire still has its rural pockets as well as areas where terrain may create a barrier to broadband access. But the sprawling region is increasingly suburban these days, and public-private partnerships are advancing the spread of broadband connectivity. And as a condition of allowing the mergers of SBC, AT&T, and Verizon MCI more than a decade ago, the Public Utilities Commission required the creation of the California Emerging Technology Fund. AT&T and Verizon contributed a total of $60 million over 5 years for the California Emerging Technology Fund's initial bankroll. The Inland Empire Regional Broadband Consortium has served as the regional hub of this nonprofit organization charged with bridging the digital divide. And the consortium attributes much of the Inland Empire divide to demographics, to poverty, geographic location, terrain, lack of infrastructure, and internet providers needing to upgrade their systems, as well as internet providers unable or unwilling to address regional needs. The consortium's planning and collaboration helped the Inland Empire increase broadband access by 10% since 2010, faster than even the California average of 9%. So there's a lot happening here in this Inland Empire region. Once a region has achieved sufficient broadband access, the barriers to individuals making use of the technology are most often expense, language, or disability. For low-income families, the expense of a computer and broadband service contracts could be prohibitive. For that reason, only 43% of families with a household income of less than $22,000 have broadband access at home, with another 25% accessing the internet by smartphone. In the Inland Empire, about 72% of households live at or below poverty level, making computers and contracts difficult to afford. Only 39% of Spanish-speaking households have reliable home access to broadband, with 30% connecting by smartphone. Now, for people with disabilities, the added technology needed to make the internet accessible can make costs an obstacle. 58% of people with disabilities have meaningful home broadband access, and another 13% use the internet only on their smartphones. Now, seniors age 65 and older are often on fixed incomes, and they simply grew up in a pre-internet age and have not learned to make use of the technology, although we see some of that changing. For both of these reasons, only 51% of seniors have home broadband access, and 5% access the internet via a smartphone. So this is what we're seeing in the Inland Empire is not too far divergent from what we see statewide. So that means 44% of California seniors go unserved by broadband networks, and this should really inform the outreach that we do in educating the public, and as well as digital technology, but also the way that businesses and government bodies attempt to communicate with our senior population. This is the fastest growing segment of our population, and we know that the services and demand for services will be great in the years ahead. Now, too many entities are going the way of internet only, potentially leaving nearly a third of people in California behind on the other side of the digital divide. Now, I am pleased to say that, I'm sorry that Lloyd Levine could not be here, but he really has been a pioneer in this area. And certainly now Secretary of State Alex Padilla, when he served in the legislature, both strong advocates in terms of enacting reforms that are going to keep pace with demographic and technological changes. And my role in all this is really to see where we have gaps relative to capacity and capability of Californians to be able to be a part of our economy, and certainly broadband and internet access is a fundamental tool for that to happen. We have Assemblymember Lloyd Levine, when he's served in the Assembly, was able to look at really directing this California Emerging Technology Fund. Senator Alex Padilla, now our Secretary of State, introduced legislation to promote the deployment of broadband infrastructure in unserved and underserved communities. And this led the California Public Utilities Commission to create the California Advanced Services Fund, which has helped bring reliable broadband service to an additional 300,000 households in the last 7 years. So we're making a little bit more progress, but still some very hard to reach places continue to be unserved. One of the largest projects made possible by the California Advanced Services Fund is the Digital 395 Middle Mile Project. And this is a 583-mile fiber optic network that runs from San Bernardino to Mono County, and bringing high-speed internet to 2,600 families, 2,500 businesses, 36 communities, 6 tribal reservations, 2 military bases. But you can think of all those different communities within that reach that is being served. Secretary Padilla also authored legislation to create the California Broadband Council, and this 9-member council includes the state's technology and education leaders, as well as several legislators continuing to provide leadership in this area. But the legislature set a goal of 98% broadband access in California by 2017. It will now fall to one of our succeeding leaders to be sure that that happens. It's a goal that should have widespread bipartisan support, as it is in the best interest of communities and our economy as a whole, from the lowest income earners are given opportunities to be lifted from poverty with the capability to connect to economic opportunity. Now, as I travel up and down the state, I think it's very clear that Californians understand this fact, that when surveyed about getting households online, only 8% of respondents replied that they didn't feel it was important. And those who have been living in our remote areas who have not been connected really do feel that they have been isolated and have been left behind. Conversely, 48% recognize that it's extremely important. So we are actually running out of money to continue doing this work, and this is going to be a subject of debate in our next legislative session, is how do we continue to honor our commitment in connecting all corners of California. According to the Public Utilities Commission, more than $144 million in broadband infrastructure projects are awaiting approval right now, and only $100 million is left in funding. So we're going to need to look at where we can seek new funds for these efforts. Now, I've talked a lot about broadband, but what does that have to do with my role as controller? We know that if we don't pay attention to who's not connected and who has been left behind by the digital divide, that our economic shifts are going to continue to leapfrog those communities. And one of the aspects that I have been focused on is really in California, with our growing inequality, we have a tax structure, as I mentioned earlier, that has not been updated since the 1930s. And as the economy continues to shift, those who are burdened with an inefficient tax structure also will be leapfrogged over with respect to economic opportunity. And by that, I mean that we have an aging tax structure that frankly is not going to be sustainable because we have a system that relies heavily on the rich in California. And don't get me wrong, I love taxing the rich. It's a progressive system, and it means that they make more, they can afford to pay more in taxes. But it's also become a very volatile revenue source because what we're actually taxing, applying tax to, is income from investment rather than income derived from wages and work. And so with that transition, we have just seen a lot more volatility in the personal income tax revenues that are coming to the state. We are seeing that there are potential threats. We hear them all the time about the rich leaving California and taking their businesses with them to other states. Some of that has happened, but not on a grand scale. I think California still is attractive to a lot of businesses, and certainly the lifestyle and quality of life here is attractive to many. But as we look at how inefficient the tax system is, we have essentially a sales tax structure that has not kept up with our economy and our economic, where we are today with our economy. It was based in the 1930s on a goods manufacturing-based economy. And today we have just moved so much further. We're a services, internet-based economy. And so the idea is there an opportunity to look at how we make the tax structure with respect to the sales tax more efficient? How can it reflect the economy of today? Because if we don't do so, what we are doing is essentially, and this, we have an election coming up in another few weeks, but there are over, I think it's close to 700 different local tax measures on the ballot throughout California. And because when you raise the sales tax rate, it's really pennies on the dollar. But when you do it multiple times, it's multiple pennies on that dollar. And it's the same base of taxpayers who pay those different rates. And so when I talk about then the burden, those who are most burdened getting passed over, if we keep this system of taxation, they're going to face the heaviest burden and probably yield the least benefit of what we have to offer relative to services that can help them. So this is an area that I'm particularly focused on, and as I look at the economic shifts that have taken place, and just even backing up, when we talk about a tax structure, what are we really talking about? I believe that a tax structure is a social compact. It's a social compact for how we decide to pay for things that really contribute to the common good. It touches on every facet of public life in California, in the United States, from funding, I wish it were funding more higher education, but from funding education to filling potholes. It's a major contributor to creating a good business climate. And it really also needs to be a tax structure that's designed to create jobs. In my years of public service, I've often grappled with tax policy. And it is something that I think when you speak to members of the business community, they will tell you, particularly CEOs, and when I was on the California Tax Commission, the Board of Equalization, I had the great privilege of representing Silicon Valley and the biotech companies in San Francisco. When you speak to those CEOs, taxes are not the first consideration about whether they decide to put their stake in the ground here in California. They understand that taxes are a cost of doing business, and they want to be a contributor to the tax base. But what they don't like is the fact that they don't have any certainty, that the rules that would apply to them relative to taxes could change at any given point in time. That there is their biggest priority is the state and local governments investing in them relative to public education for preparing their future workforce, Is it supporting them with respect to the infrastructure they need to facilitate their workers being able to get to work or to move goods to market? Are we looking at affordable housing where their employees can work and can afford to live close to where they work? These are the considerations that CEOs look at. And as we have seen with growing inequality and certainly the high cost of living, particularly in some sectors, in some regions of the state, this is becoming a more daunting set of questions to answer. When I served as Chief Deputy Director for Budget at the California State Department of Finance, I developed the state budget, and it was roiled by extreme swings in revenues. I was at the forefront of the stock market dive in 2000, and we immediately saw that we were going to have to figure out how to essentially make over $2 billion in cuts to balance our budget, just from one year to the other. And as a member of the State Board of Equalization, I saw firsthand how some of the unintended implications of tax policy affected small businesses and other taxpayers. And now as the state's Chief Fiscal Officer, I'm responsible for managing cash flow at a time of continued revenue volatility. So it really does create a lot of uncertainty. It creates a sense of instability. Forget about predictability. But when I look at the need for comprehensive tax reform, which is something that we have started the conversation over, it is really for two main goals. One, to facilitate, have a structure that facilitates more sound fiscal management. And secondly, a tax structure that truly is going to work relative to spurring economic development and growth. And that what has been broken over the history, we saw the chart earlier about where revenues came from in the early days of our history. And when we look at what's really broken is this partnership, this relationship between the state and local governments. That so much more of the responsibility now for how we support new businesses in California falls to local governments. And the state doesn't really play a big role. We certainly are the biggest funder of public education, but when it comes to the things that really matter as to whether a business is going to stay here or not, those responsibilities really fall on local governments and probably local school districts. So this relationship between the state and local governments needs to be healed. And when we look at the revenue raising authority that the state and local governments have, that's really, most of that has been shifted to the state. Very little authority resides with local government. And so what you see is really with the few tools that are left, that's why we have over 700 local measures on the ballot in November. Local governments, local school districts are looking at either putting a parcel tax in place or adding to the sales tax rate locally, but that is how they're generating revenue. And you can blame that on Prop 13. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but really what's broken is the fact that we don't have a partnership, a true partnership where when we talk about infrastructure, that there's equal participation by the state and local governments. When we talk about public education, that there is no community that's left behind because there isn't a capacity in one region of the state in terms of generating local property taxes for schools as compared to another region. That we know that that our affluent communities are should not always be at the top of the heap with respect to having the highest level of services when so many other communities go without. So that's the discussion we need to have. And over the course of the state's history, policymakers have tried to overhaul the tax system, and really to little avail. They see economies shifting and want to get out ahead of it, but really to no avail. Some of the more recent conversations have been about the fact that we're in this, internet services-related economy now. We don't tax digital downloads, and should we? We don't tax services. In California, one of the biggest states in the nation that does not tax services. Should we? When we look at the personal income tax, a lot of the, as I said earlier, a lot of the burden placed on our upper income earners. Should that be flattened out a little bit? Now, what I would suggest is that when you speak to business leaders, when you speak to average Californians, taxes aren't going to solve all of our woes. Changing our tax structure is not going to solve all of our problems. Because when you look at other costs of doing business in California, most CEOs will tell you the regulatory environment here in California is what's adding costs to their doing business here. It's the environmental regulations. It's the being able to be compliant with air quality, water quality, just permitting requirements, environmental review costs. So all of those things are adding to their cost of doing business. When you speak to an average Californian, it's things like paying tuition for their children to go to college. It's looking at the high cost of housing and transportation and all that increasing. So you can see that the conversation quickly is moving away from taxes, but more about how do we gain a more level playing field for all Californians and for businesses to be able to look at California as a place where everyone can have a place in its shifting economy going forward. So we're once again in that position of where we need to have this conversation, and hopefully not in the halls of the legislature, but a more public conversation. More public conversation. All of us should be focused on this. The fact that we don't have economic opportunity here in California necessarily, for many of you who will be graduating, is really relates to what we need to do relative to hopefully lifting the burden on student debt. And I know there's a lot of focus on that at the national political level this year. But we also need to look at where are those job opportunities going to come from? What companies are going to be here and want to be here and know that we're doing a good job of investing in our higher education institutions and producing that workforce for them. And I can say that over the last 2 decades, legislators have tried all kinds of different tax incentives to answer those questions. But really what they're doing is piling on to an inefficient tax structure that maybe helps in the short term, but in the long term is not going to do much good. Over the past 2 decades, legislators have considered an average of 245 tax measures each year. And they've been very, very focused on particular industries, particular types of incentives to spur economic development. And they just have not been interested in tackling the whole of our tax structure. And the reason why we need to look at tackling the whole of it is because almost every aspect of it is inefficient. I had mentioned Prop 13 earlier, and how many of you are native Californians? Okay. You may have had some involvement or learned about Prop 13. In 1978, when California voters decided that there was a fear of particularly seniors being taxed out of their homes, because prior to 1978, when the property tax rate was capped at 1% by voters, the rate was set by what all local jurisdictions needed to fund their operations. And so it was a cumulative rate within a county. And those rates kept growing and growing as needs kept getting greater and greater. And there was a fear that seniors would be taxed out of their homes. And so the effort was essentially a taxpayer revolt that capped the property tax at 1%. And that's what we've been living with since. Whether you think that has merit or not, and I'm not going to even delve into that, the effects of Prop 13 essentially started to then put a heavy reliance on other types of revenue. And so the property tax gets squeezed, and so what do we rely on? We rely on the sales tax. We rely on special fees. We rely on special assessments. We rely on a parcel tax. And so we've been layering all of these revenue-raising tools on top of one another. And particularly on poor communities, they really are paying a pretty heavy burden. Given that that's where the needs are the greatest, that's where we need to raise revenue, and that's where the rates are just placed on top of one another. So in the decades since Prop 13, the sales tax and the corporation tax have dwindled as the highly progressive personal income tax produces an ever greater share of our general fund revenues. It's producing it's approaching about 70% of our general fund revenue now. And because it's so volatile, I mean, it gives me heartburn every time I think about it, because it could change on a dime if we have the stock market just tank in the near term, and we would have, again, huge revenue swings as a result of that. It is the downside, and particularly the personal income tax, obviously, is the huge swings, but it's also the reason that our bond rating agencies have been paying attention to our financial condition. Moody's recently ranked California among larger states as the least prepared to withstand the next recession. And economic forecasters now do expect that we're going to be experiencing a downturn within the next 3 to 4 years, but not a recession. But even with a downturn, as things tighten, we're seeing the job numbers tighten a bit. Our resiliency with respect to being able to withstand even a downturn is in question. Another study at George Mason University found that California ranked poorly on a measure of fiscal stress, and in part because of shortfalls in areas such as cash solvency, long-term solvency, and trust fund solvency. And when we look at a tax system, we'd like to think that a tax system can address these various areas as well. Now, I'm just talking about the state. We haven't even talked about the more than 500 cities and the 58 counties and the special districts that face these same dilemmas. But also, when we experience revenue volatility at the state level, that does trickle down to our local governments. And this is crucial to the economy, as local governments, as I said, are the primary providers of services that support our business community. Now, I really believe this is a good time to talk about tax reform, because we have been experiencing for the last period of years probably the longest period of fiscal stability that we have in California for quite some time. In large part thanks to what the voters did a few years ago in enacting Proposition 30, the temporary tax increases, that placed a additional rate of tax on our upper income earners, and also enacted a sales tax on a temporary basis. The income tax increase is proposed to be extended in this November's election. But it gave us this really sense of stability to where we can restore some cuts that were made to public education. I'm sorry to say that policymakers have not done their job in restoring higher education to the levels where it should be. If we were to look at where it was prior to the Great Recession and where it should be today, still underfunded. But when we look at the state of our economy here in California, we are in our 7th year of recovery after the Great Recession. And rule of thumb is that after a downturn, you are in a period of recovery for about 5 years, and then things begin to tighten again. We're in our 7th year, and we are starting to see things plateau, but again, no recession in sight, just tightening. So our tax structure is really embedded in kind of a philosophy about the choices we want to make about how we pay for public services. And why it's important that all of you are focused on this is because your consumers are probably one of the most important public services in California, and that is public education. And other states, even those with tax loads that exceed or meet California's, underwrite public services with different mixes of taxes, and so we're looking at what other states are doing. Is there more resiliency, better resiliency with a different mix of taxes? So that is part of the research going into how we might want to approach reform. But I also think that this is a time when we need to look at how we change our tax structure to better reflect our priorities and certainly our current challenges. Now, all of the things I mentioned earlier with respect to housing, high cost of living, growing inequality, some of it can be addressed through the tax system, but most of it is about policy priorities that lawmakers are going to have to come to grips with. But what we can do is to give them a foundation within which to make those choices, and that the decisions that they make are not going to exacerbate the issue of inequality. It's not going to exacerbate the numbers of Californians living in poverty, and certainly is not going to widen our income gap that we see here in California. So a couple months ago, my office issued a framework for how we look at comprehensive tax reform, and Nicole has a copy of that, but we have a couple copies that we have here with us. But the whole idea here is that we didn't propose any solutions. And frankly, this takes really a very deliberate effort. As I said, when lawmakers have tackled this in the past, it's really been about, it's not been reform. It's essentially been looking at how we raise revenues to fund services. And when we look at reform, it's a tougher conversation to have. But frankly, it is a conversation that is needed. And it is one that I hope is embedded in some values around fairness and who bears the burden of our tax structure, how we continue to make California's economy grow and thrive, and also about how we look to create opportunities for the future, particularly for our new emerging Californians into our workforce. So our initial rapid growth in California was sparked by gold. And in the 166 years, we have surged to the world's sixth largest economy due largely to tiny bits of silicon. Our state has weathered boom and bust, from the depths of the Depression to the heights of the dot-com bubble, through recession and recovery to where we are today. That recovery, as I've mentioned, has reached many, but not all. And as a public official, I believe that my job is to be sure that we recognize those for whom the recovery has not reached, and to connect them to opportunity and give them the tools to be able to be a part of our recovery. And I believe comprehensive tax reform is one such opportunity. Now, how do you have this conversation publicly with over 39 million Californians? And this is the challenge that we have, which is why I'm so focused on technology as being a tool for how we have that conversation. But more importantly, it's going to be one where it has to be a public conversation because it will become very political very quickly. And until we get broad-based support and recognition that our current tax structure is unsustainable, as cost pressures continue to rise, and as we have revenues that are not going to meet the level of demand that we want in terms of our services, we need to have this conversation. Obviously, our tax structure has not evolved with the times as technology and population growth have raced ahead, and comprehensive tax reform continues to elude our policymakers. We have had some interesting conversations with policymakers after the framework was issued. And I think now with legislators serving longer terms in our legislature and understanding that under their watch, our current structure may not be able to meet all of our needs now, that they feel a little bit more invested in being a part of this conversation. Now, it's been a tough conversation because obviously attendant to having any kind of conversation like this, there will be trade-offs. There will be trade-offs. So, and some questions that I know will get asked is, will reform address, the current local dependence that cities and counties have on state fiscal policy? Local governments don't have a lot of authority when it comes to revenue. They have a lot of responsibilities, but relatively little authority. Will local governments be given greater discretion then as a matter of tax policy, being able to set their own tax and spending policy? If local governments are given that discretion to raise taxes, then should the state reduce taxes commensurately? What's that state-local relationship going to look like? Will reform mean that we reduce the income taxes paid by investors and those that create capital gains or tax on capital gains? Will other taxpayers then be expected to make up the difference if we give them a break, give investors a break? Should users like drivers be expected to pay the full cost of infrastructure of our roads and other improvements through user fees? Or should taxpayers also pay a share through higher sales tax or personal income taxes? So the idea is, who bears the burden? Is it just those who use it, or is this more of a statewide interest, a matter of statewide interest? Will a conversation necessarily also need to occur with respect to improved government performance? And this is something that I think has not been given the same attention. We've seen a lot of efforts in the past about budget reform, about tax reform, but we've not really delved into how government can do its job better. And we also have not talked about how, whether government is doing too much, So I think there's a great opportunity to look at those questions when we talk about tax reform. Can taxes be cut at the same time that service delivery can be improved? Because we haven't integrated technology fully. How can we be sure that we have improved performance that is transparent so that the public understands how government is serving them? And what can be done to improve accountability? This is something I'm very, very focused on. Certainly as the role of controller and having independent fiscal oversight, particularly through our audit program, we see a lot of state and local agencies continue to do business the way that they've always done business. But we also see that we have a dearth of new financial managers and leaders coming into state and local government, such that there are mistakes that are being made, that the controls aren't as strong as they should be. And just in the 19 months that I've been in office, my audit team has been able to unearth $2.8 billion in public funds that have been directed to unallowed uses. And this is it's not intentional. It's because we don't have the institutional knowledge anymore about how to really manage our finances in government. Will tax reform include the necessary conversation we need to have about regulations and compliance costs for businesses? And how will that change affect Californians who aren't directly regulated? And then I think probably the most important question is who bears what burden, right? Should the poorest continue to bear the great burden of the state not investing adequately in child care and other programs like universal broadband access with the potential of lifting families out of poverty? Certainly with respect to the tax system, I think when we look at the tax system, the burden, I think fairness is in the eyes of the beholder a lot of times, but there is a way to look at a sustainable tax system that really does create fair burdens across all income levels. But at its heart, a tax system is, like I said, a social compact. It details how we pay for the common good. Definitions of the common good certainly vary. But I think people, as I've been able to have conversations with policymakers on both sides of the aisle, all agree that our current tax structure does not reflect our times and is broken. And regardless of our differences, it is time to come together to fix it. Now, we talked about the trade-offs. And I would argue that, we are definitely committed to sound fiscal management, and we've foregone a great deal of spending and saved for a rainy day. So on the spending side, we actually have been doing some very good work and some good discipline with putting away some of the revenues that are associated with volatile income. And so we have a rainy day fund that is being built up quite handsomely. On the other hand, that's on the spending side. So we still have this inefficient tax structure. I would also argue that it is a rainy day for those who are left on the other side of the digital divide. That if we don't incorporate them into our economy, we are missing out on so many opportunities. And you look at the effects on policymakers of how are we going to deal with issues of transportation, the issues of our drought in California. The legislature is currently at an impasse with respect to how we deal with transportation financing in California. But when we look at issues like the drought, or how we are going to deal with global climate change, these are the issues that really require the participation of Californians who are experiencing the effects of these challenges every day. And so an investment in meaningful broadband for all is certainly something that I will be working with legislators on. It is, as I said, a way to be sure that no one is left behind. But also, we want to be sure that our tax structure is updated so that as we are able to expand upon economic opportunities here in California and attracting new economic opportunities, creating more innovation and opportunities for innovation here in California, that communities that have been not part of this economy are participating in it and once again aren't subject to being leapfrogged over once again. So let me conclude by saying that I look out to each and every one of you as a stakeholder in comprehensive tax reform. It is something that I hope doesn't hurt your head when you think about it, but I hope that you will think about it with respect to how it affects your lives. And that's the conversation we need to be having. What are the burdens that you are facing? With respect to, it may not even be about tax, but everything has a connection back to tax. And the conversation we will have will be one that will be focused on particularly economic development. We are working with local economic development directors throughout the state, and we'll be engaged in conversations about what is it that makes you really pursue those companies that likely want to do business here. And a large part of the attractiveness of California, I must say, is the fact that there are institutions like the University of California, Riverside, right in their backyard. So you all are assets, and really kind of on the positive side of the ledger of that conversation. But you can easily, individually, be on the negative side of that ledger if you aren't able to afford housing here. if you're not able to, deal with the high cost of living, and hopefully you're going to be making a living wage to be able to be a part of our economy. And so these are all of the attendant questions. And so I'm going to just leave you by saying that every California is a stakeholder in comprehensive reform, including each and every one of you. So with that, what I'd like to do is just open it up for questions. But, as I think about where California has been in our history, from gold to silicon, and then obviously now looking at where we're headed, we've got the smarts, we've got the tools, we've got the technology, and really now it's about really muscling the political will to make the change. And so all of you are a part of that. Help us be a part of just creating that platform of support to just even begin the conversation. Thank you all very much.
So we have plenty of time for Q&A.
Yeah.
So if no, okay, already we have. I had one prepared.
Oh.
I think that's the trend. Yeah.
So
please say who you are and your affiliation.
My name is Omer. I'm a student ambassador. My major is public policy. Control. How do you make the basic divide between investments that are going to pay off in the long term but are short term expensive, like the healthy communities movement? How would you justify those costs, to someone saying, listen, that's expensive right now, especially to local governments with very constrained budgets?
Yeah. When I look at the work that has to be done, to me, I don't think local governments can do this alone, and I also think the state can't do this alone. I'm very focused on the state-local relationship because that was really the history of the state in the early days. And, I think it has to be a partnership. Frankly, the state did away with one of its biggest economic development programs in terms of dissolving redevelopment a few years ago, and which not only did away with economic development, but also much needed capital for affordable housing. And so I think that relationship needs to be mended. Local governments can't do it alone because you have so many different capacities among local jurisdictions that the state has to be in a more robust relationship with our local governments. But having said that, the whole issue about investments. So this has been something that's very frustrating because all of us know, when you invest in public higher education, the return is, multifold. And but of course, when policymakers make those decisions about how much they invest, it's on an annual budget basis, and so it's not a apples to apples kind of conversation. But I do think that when we start to look at tax reform, when we start to look at how we characterize certainly tuition in that conversation, when we start to look at how businesses look at higher education and the meaning that it has for them, I think there's a way to elevate the types of investments that are going to be that will have a direct impact on our economic growth.
Thank you.
Hi. Nice to have you here.
Tell me your name.
My name is Abhijit. I am a economics PhD student.
Yes.
And actually one of my interests is actually in doing research work on state and local revenue and tax structure.
Oh, bless you.
Yeah. So my question was, I think you mentioned in I think one of your points was that you're going to study the other tax structures of states similar to California, but from your knowledge, what would you say is the difference between other states' tax structures and California's tax structure?
Yes. So as you know, some states don't have an income tax.
Yeah.
Some states don't have a sales tax. So it runs the whole gamut. The way that we've been looking at other states is certainly other large states like California.
Yeah.
We've looked at kind of states by region, so the western region states. And I think for me, the lesson that I've learned is that it's not so much the level of tax as the mix of taxes.
Okay.
And we have states that do well, economically, but although recently they're not doing so well because their main source of income are extraction-related taxes, right? And so, so to me, the mix is really important. And so then you talk about the mix, then what does that translate into in terms of the burden? Who bears the burden? So I do think that what we have done here in California, we're overly reliant on the sales tax, but we're not getting the yield. It's inefficient. It's an outdated system, and it's a shrinking base. Now, in the personal income tax, because it is so volatile, and it does, it's a very, very small base that pays the majority of our personal income taxes. But, if the federal government decides they're going to target the same taxpayers with tax changes, we could easily see them moving to states that don't have an income tax. So it is really the mix and kind of giving a sense that we're trying to be fair with the burden, and hopefully that mix also creates some resilience with respect to economic changes, so that we're not having these, just huge spikes right, exactly.
So I have a question related to that.
Uh-huh.
So, especially with any policy, but especially with tax policies, you have winners and losers.
Yes,
So any change to that,
yes.
Would you expect to see resistance from people that are currently benefiting from this system, or people that may stand to lose in whatever change?
That's always the heart of the challenge, is winners and losers. Change is difficult, but change is even more difficult when you're talking about dollars lost. So, which is why I think this conversation has to be much broader than taxes. If the trade-off is that the business community is willing to pay more in taxes if we can help reduce some of that regulatory burden, that might be a good trade-off. If middle-income Californians, if we're going to have less reliance on the rich and try to smooth out the personal income tax, I'm not proposing to tax the middle class more, but how about looking at some of the things that are burdening the middle class right now? That's probably a conversation worth having. So this is really kind of, to your question, Dean, it's an illustration of how the tax structure, the reform just to the tax structure is not going to solve everything. And so you have to broaden the conversation to include other costs and other benefits that may result in at the end of the day. Hi.
You pitched a question.
Your name and...
My name is Jeff McLaughlin. I'm a graduate of UC Riverside.
Hi.
And I'm the Economic Development Director.
Good.
You pitched a question at the end, and I wanted to answer it, and then I wanted to pitch a question your direction.
Okay.
You said, I'm going to ask Economic Development Directors why they have to go after businesses, why we have to go after business attraction, why that's become so integrated in terms of what we do. It is because economic development has become so localized and so zero-sum in terms of how we have to execute it, that we are forced to compete locally, regionally, and really state to state now in terms of getting businesses in and wild deals and trying to do a business location. And part of this comes back to tax policy, obviously. One, we want to get these businesses in because we want them to pay sales taxes. We want their employees to live in our communities and pay the incumbent taxes. I think what we're missing here is some broader economic planning at the regional and the state level. That has happened in other states in the U.S. where you have fairly cohesive economic development policies that are statewide policies.
Right.
Hasn't happened in California.
It's happening in some regions. It's starting to happen again.
But we sort of lurch.
Yes.
We lurch from reason to
So let's
reason.
move to the questions.
The question is, what would it take to engage a statewide economic development strategy using the models that we know?
I think it's very difficult on a statewide level. I think the best we can hope for is at the regional level, that hopefully then can inform a statewide effort. When I travel the state, the places that I really am very interested in are the Inland Empire, the Central Valley, and Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley because it's had some experience in this, and they're actually doing this very same thing now because they're running out of options in terms of how to provide for their infrastructure locally. They can't keep increasing the sales tax, for transportation, which is what they've been doing, and they're now meeting a lot of resistance to that. But also the growing inequality in Silicon Valley. So there are a whole myriad of issues there. They are now engaged in a multi-pronged effort to essentially establish a regional economic development plan by industry clusters and also with business, government, labor, academia, but really trying to coordinate all of that. It will take time, but I do think because Silicon Valley is such a focal point, all eyes are on that. With respect to the Inland Empire, because to me, this is a little bit of ground zero. You have in my mind, all of the necessary components are here, and so how do we get it jump-started? And whether it's through this university, whether it's through some of our local electeds, but I'm happy to kind of bring, I mean, my foray into this, I'm focused on the tax aspect of it, but I know that's not going to be the one that attracts people to the table. But at the same time, there was so much potential in this Inland Empire. You've got the diversity, you've got the geographic location, you've got all the positives about being in this region that really could have a very successful economic future. And so I hope that conversation starts here. I'm very happy to be a part of that. But I think regionally is where we need to be, because as soon as we have a state level effort, the whole question of winners and losers begins to happen. Politically, you have the 800-pound gorillas from Los Angeles start to take over. You have the high cost areas like Silicon Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area begin to take over. So this is where it needs to happen, and I think the models are going to happen here. And frankly, the benefits will stay here because you will have engaged all the stakeholders within the region. Okay. Yes?
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm a second-year public policy major.
Good.
As a UC alum, what do you believe the role that students have in advocating for the state to reaffirm their commitment to higher education funding, and do you have any advice on how to navigate that?
Yep, show up. I was so happy. I have to tell you, I was so happy. I think starting 3 years ago when we saw students marching to Sacramento from all of our higher education segments. It reminded me of the 60s, frankly, and but that's what you have to do. But also, both Nicole and I have been on the Cal Alumni Board. We've actually activated our alumni networks throughout the world to be part of this advocacy effort, and we can do that because we're separate and apart from the university. But no, it truly is about showing up. I mean, frankly, your faces are invisible if you don't show up in masses, and work with your local legislative delegation, and really create the force that you're going to be reckoned with. This isn't going to work in terms of where this gentleman wants to go, in terms of an economic vision and direction, if we don't deal with our investment up front. And so a lot of this has to also do with engaging other stakeholders who share your concern. The business community very much shares your concern. And then as we look at certainly families that are just saddled with the fact that once we decoupled student financial aid from tuition increases, I mean, it just has gone so amok. And and then obviously what the feds are trying to do with student loan debt. But the main thing is show up. And if there's a way that you can be involved, I know UC does have its advocacy days, so when you can come up to Sacramento, that's even better. But if not, show up at your local legislator's doorstep.
So I have a follow-up question to that.
Yeah.
Many people in Sacramento still think of UCs as their related to their education mission, not as much as their research mission and the kind of economic contributions, especially from the kind of spin-offs that come out of UC.
Right.
So, I mean, where do you see that going? What advice would you give to the UC to kind of better make its case for what it's like?
I think you want to definitely have good partnerships with the private sector segments to help you make that case. I know that when we see biotech and high tech and just some of these industries show up and talk about preparing the next workforce, legislators do listen. They do listen. Now, but you need to be right there with them. And the investments, and unfortunately, I mean, we've had this trend, and one of the things I didn't share is that the percentage of research dollars to higher education has diminished so much, particularly from the federal government. I mean, in the 1960s, that was the majority of the funding that came to higher ed, particularly UCs, and now it's just a very, very paltry amount. But you do need to have the companies and technologies and the innovations that are existing today and that are emerging to be a part of that conversation, because we're going to lose all that elsewhere if we don't make the investment here. And biotech's been a very successful advocacy force in Sacramento. The whole life sciences area has been very, very effective because they've been able to weave in the importance of their industry, the importance of having the brightest minds in their industry, because of dealing with the issues that we're dealing with: an aging population, people living longer, diseases with whether it's caused by climate change or anything else. But just connect it with other issues, because what lawmakers are really not good at doing is just seeing the interconnectedness between issues. And when they do see that, and when they hear it, and when they actually see companies actually working on this, understanding that there is a relationship with what they do to so many aspects of what's going on in the world, that's very helpful. It's very helpful. Yes?
Hi, so my name is Danielle Flores. I'm a second year sustainability major
Yes.
at Oxford Public Policy. I also recognize your name. You're a Lowell alumni.
I am.
Right?
Oh my goodness. We're going back to high school now. Good.
I was also a Lowell alumni. I just graduated 2 years ago. But I just wanted to ask you, started off this discussion in regards to broadband. And
Yes.
you also ended it with that too. You talked a lot about the technological divide and how you feel like that's the way, you don't want to like leapfrog past the communities that don't have broadband. So do you have a plan, do you have like a plan to basically allow broadband to reach those communities that don't have it already?
Yeah. I mean, I think the work that then Assemblymember Levine and now Secretary of State Padilla did was really on the right track. They've been effective. We've been able to connect more communities, and certainly along the 395 corridor, that's true. I will say that there are communities that are still definitely like being connected. I mean, this is really interesting in the 21st century. They like being kind of in the remote areas and not necessarily wanting to be part of a bigger universe. But having said that, a lot of it is resources. And so, because these are going to involve regulated entities by the Public Utilities Commission, they will essentially kind of direct where that money is going to come from going forward. Obviously, the legislature has a say, but all of the surcharges we pay on our phone bills and utility bills, I mean, that's what all that is being directed towards. But I think this conversation can't be an isolated conversation from what we do in terms of developing economic development plans. I mean, this is just like transportation used to be an afterthought after we talked about economic development. Transportation is economic development. Just as broadband shouldn't be a last-minute thought with respect to the economy, it should be very much a part of how we talk about an economic plan. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Som Jathareli. I'm a fourth-year neuroscience major and also a writer for the school newspaper.
Wonderful.
So going off of the previous question, highlighting this digital divide, as you mentioned, and also the commitment to connecting all corners of California and broadening the conversation, as you put it. How important, in your mind, is the passing of Proposition 54, which is going to be coming up in this year's election, in November, just a couple weeks from now?
I'm aware of it.
Which aims at digitizing all legislative processes. So, in your mind, how important would that be?
I support Prop 54. This is a very interesting question. There are 17 statewide ballot measures on the ballot in November. Proposition 54 I support, and really the basis of my support is we have so much work to do in terms of elevating civic engagement in California. And that is a tool. Let's give people something to engage about. The work of the legislature is not the most transparent, and I know that. I used to work there, and is still very much the case. But this whole issue about just being transparent and accountable and making government more accessible, I think is very, very key. Is very key. You can't have good policies, you can't have informed policy without the participation of those who are most affected by what you're doing relative to those policy areas. And so I think when I talk about the digital divide, it's very much in line with people getting access to information and policies that are going to affect them. I actually, just an aside, got hammered pretty hard for supporting Proposition 54 because it is financed in large part by Charles Munger. To me, it's not a partisan issue. It is an issue about good government. It is an issue about the role of government. It is an issue, if we're going to deal with trying to get the broadest level of participation among Californians, it is essential. And it's a small piece. We're only talking about really legislative activity, but that could certainly grow. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Evan Ismail. I'm a first-year political science major. I'm also a writer for the campus newspaper. I'm doing an article on Proposition 51.
Yes.
And I'd like to know that if there's a plan to upgrade California schools and
So Proposition 51 is the school bond measure for facilities, for new schools and facility modernization. I am on the fence on that measure because I do think that the state allocation board that actually allocates the bond proceeds is a mess. I don't think they've updated their criteria for how to allocate school bond proceeds, and that's not necessarily a reason to oppose the measure, but the measure also did not get a lot of legislative scrutiny. And I do feel like it's a little bit of a special interest bond measure that was spearheaded by developers. But one of the major criticisms of the state allocation board is that they don't really have criteria that looks at how we award bond proceeds for schools that doesn't encourage them sprawl, longer commutes for students to get to school, looking at local participation in terms of financing some of that work. So from a facility standpoint, the needs are great. We definitely need to do something, but the thinking hasn't been updated in terms of how we do that more efficiently. Is modernization essentially and necessarily now being sure that all schools are wired? I hope so, but we haven't seen an articulation of that. Schools have been, the bond proceeds have generally been awarded on a first come, first served basis without regard to areas of need over others. And so there's a lot of work that has to happen on the allocation portion of the process. With respect to the dollars, $9 billion, is that the right amount? I don't know. But you also have then local participation, and of course those areas, those school districts in areas where there's not a lot of capacity to participate continue to be left behind. So I'm not sure that's the answer to what we need to do in terms of upgrading facilities. Definitely we need more dollars, but we also need to know, also need to spend those dollars more smartly. So that's just on facilities, and then obviously we have Prop 55, which is extending the income tax increase from Prop 30, and that most of those revenues will be going to schools for ongoing operation.
So I have one question.
Yes.
Maybe there's another one after that. I wanted to ask about the rainy day fund.
Yes.
Right. So there's so much volatility. What impact, if any, do you think the rainy day fund will have for the next economic downturn?
I think having a rainy day fund is good. It has been to the consternation of some of the lawmakers in Sacramento because obviously we're doing very well revenue-wise, and they'd like to be able to use those revenues to provide increases in the budget to certain areas of the budget. On the other hand, we know that a lot of the revenue that we're getting in is one-time in nature, potentially, because our stock market riches aren't going to last forever. So by the time we hit the next downturn, we are going to be close to having a rainy day fund that's going to reflect close to 10% of our general fund budget. So, and that is hopefully going to be spent on what the governor and legislature have been very good at doing, is using some of those dollars to pay down our debt, to look at eventually helping to address some of our long-term liabilities, whether it be in infrastructure, and I hope that there will be some more infrastructure investment, because we know that just putting people to work and generating conditional economic activity is good. But we also have a long road to travel with respect to the biggest ongoing outstanding liability, and that is in our public pension funds. Our net pension liabilities are great. I never want to be in a position to say we should tax just to address that. Clearly, being on the pension boards, we're going to have to do something relative to pension benefits and the direction of our pension funds to keep them sustainable. But from a spending discipline standpoint, the rainy day fund has done its job, and I think the governor and the legislature should be applauded for that.
But it's not a substitute for reform.
No, not at all, not at all. Other questions? Yes.
My name is Myron. I'm a fourth-year political science major with a minor in public policy. And you might know this. I'm just curious in regards to the incarceration system. What truth is it that we spend much more money in people in jail than we do in education? And where does the main revenue come from? Is it personal income tax?
Mm-hmm.
Or?
It all comes out of the same pot. So the general fund is made up of 70% personal income tax revenue, and then sales tax makes up another, I think, close to 26%, I think, and then other corporation tax is a very small sliver of our general fund revenue. They're all competing for those dollars, corrections in schools. Now, K-12 education, or actually K-14 education, is protected somewhat because of the Prop 98 funding formula. But higher education, CSU, UCs are not. So you are in direct competition with what we allocate and appropriate for correctional programs. So, and there's been a lot of attention on this. Now the governor, because of the attention on this, has been embarking on programs that hopefully will save on spending on the correctional side in terms of early release, looking at putting the responsibility for low-level offenders on counties and local governments. I would say that that's not a long-term solution, because frankly, if the funding doesn't go with the responsibility, we're not really solving the problem. There have to be supportive services to be sure that we are really making some headway. But I do think there's a growing recognition, and certainly, as all of you are talking about, how you can be better advocates for higher education funding increases. That's very much front and center every budget cycle now. So, which is why I say show up. Keep that on their radar when they're having to make those choices about how much to appropriate to corrections versus higher education. This governor's been under a lot of pressure. He did not want to do some of the early release policies, but was under court order in part, but also under a lot of public pressure to do that, given what we've done to our funding for schools, particularly with the Great Recession and not being able to still make up the cuts that we had to make during the downturn.
Great, we have time for one last question. Okay.
So, given what you said about the Moody's report, which essentially said that California wasn't prepared or isn't prepared as much as it could be for an upcoming recession, given how, it's been 8 years, as you said, business cycles around 10 years, so it's around the corner. Given how the Fed has continually kept interest rates down, given how the housing prices are really rising, suggesting a housing bubble, given all these concerns, it seems to me that a recession could potentially be around the corner. And with, I guess, tax reform, is there a quick fix that we can do given this sort of urgency?
It's a great question. It's a great question. There are no quick fixes. We got here because of quick fixes. Okay, and it's going to be a painful conversation to have. It'll be a long conversation. I've had editorial boards as I've talked to them about, my interest in leading this. Well, you're the tax expert. What should be done? I have ideas, but this is one where everyone has got to be engaged on this, and it's got to be long term. And you can't just fix one aspect of the structure and think that you're home free. And so we got here because we've layered over fixes on top of each other, which is why the system is so inefficient now. So with respect to the next downturn that's coming, it won't be a recession. I mean, nobody's forecasting a recession. On the other hand, as things tighten, there are going to have to be some tough choices made if we don't have tax reform on the spending side. On the spending side. So when you look at what's truly discretionary in our state budget right now, it's a very, very small percentage. That's not tied to some statutory formula or federal mandate or state mandate. And I know when I was a state budget director in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the amount of the general fund, of the $100 billion general fund that was truly discretionary, was 2%. 2%. And the rest of it, we have to pay debt service. We have to make our contributions to our pension funds. We've got to fund, K-12 education. We've got federal mandates, or else we lose federal funding. So all of those things. But 2% is what we're fighting over, essentially. So, but I do think there's a way to do tax reform if you don't tie it to your goal being raising revenue. And it really is about how do you create an environment where there can be some stability, where there can be some certainty, where there can be a little bit more of a semblance of fairness about who bears the burden. If you kind of look at it that way, the trade-offs might be that you get a tax structure that will generate more revenue, but actually be more fair. And again, the mix of taxes matters. So that's the conversation. It will be a tough conversation. I'm getting no political points for this, believe me. But at the same time, I'm a native Californian. I had great opportunities. I had a great education. We're all blessed to be part of this UC system, and I just feel like it's the contribution we can make to be sure that these doors are open for those who follow us.
Well, that's a very hopeful note. So thank you once again. discussion outside, so please join us.
Great.